April 1st, 1970. April Fool's Day. For most Americans back home, it was a day for pranks, for jokes, for laughter. But in South Vietnam, 5 miles from the Cambodian border, 220 young Americans were about to experience the deadliest day of the deadliest month of the entire Vietnam War. Fire Support Base Illingworth. Even the name sounds temporary, doesn't it? That's because it was. Carved out of a dried-up pond bed in the middle of War Zone C, this tiny outpost was nothing more than 20 bunkers connected by a 4-foot earthen berm, sitting in a clearing surrounded by triple canopy jungle, no perimeter fence, no concertina wire. Just claymore mines scattered outside the fortifications, and 220 men standing between civilization and chaos. But here's what makes this story different from every other fire-based battle you've heard about. These men knew they were bait. They understood they'd been dangled out in front of the North Vietnamese army, like a piece of meat in front of a hungry lion, and they resented it. Decades later, survivors still carry that resentment, that feeling of being used, of being expendable. 24 Americans would die on Fire Support Base Illingworth that night. 54 more would be wounded. That's a 40% casualty rate. Nearly half of everyone on that base would be killed or wounded in just a few hours of fighting. And it wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. It was brutal, desperate, hand-to-hand combat in pitch darkness, with weapons jamming, ammunition exploding, and the enemy so close you could smell their breath. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This is the story of Fire Support Base Illingworth. It's a story about courage, about sacrifice, about young men fighting impossible odds. But it's also a story about strategy, about the difficult decisions commanders make, and about the price soldiers pay when they're used as bait to lure out an enemy. It's about a 19-year-old Canadian immigrant who would earn the Medal of Honor while high on marijuana. It's about a battalion commander who requested his base be moved to safer ground and was denied. It's about artillerymen forced to fight as infantry, about weapons that jammed at the worst possible moment, and about an ammunition dump that exploded with the force of a small nuclear weapon. April 1st, 1970. The deadliest day of the deadliest month of the war. And it all happened at a dusty, miserable little fire base that most Americans have never heard of. Let's tell that story now. To understand what happened at Illingworth, you need to understand where it was and why it was there. War Zone C. That's what they called it. Roughly 100 square miles of jungle hell northwest of Saigon, pressed right up against the Cambodian border. The North Vietnamese army owned this territory. The whole area was honeycombed with tributaries of the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail, pockmarked with hidden supply bases, and crawling with NVA, regulars who could slip across the border into Cambodia whenever things got too hot. Cambodia was a sanctuary. The Americans couldn't officially pursue the enemy across that border. Not yet anyway. That would come later with the Cambodian incursion, which would begin just 1 month after the battle at Illingworth. But in early 1970, the border was a line that couldn't be crossed. The NVA knew it. They used it. They'd hit American positions, then fade back into Cambodia to regroup, rearm, and prepare for the next attack. Major General L.V. Roberts commanded the 1st Cavalry Division. But the real architect of strategy in War Zone C was his deputy, Brigadier General George Casey Sr. Casey was a rising star in the Army, aggressive, innovative, and willing to try new tactics. He'd served multiple tours in Vietnam and was widely respected by his men. He would assume command of the entire 1st Cavalry Division in May 1970. Tragically, just 2 months after that, on July 7, 1970, he would be killed in a helicopter crash while flying to visit wounded soldiers. At age 48, George Casey Sr. would be posthumously promoted to Major General and buried at Arlington National Cemetery. But in March and April of 1970, George Casey was alive and full of ideas about how to fight this war differently. The problem was straightforward. American forces were beginning to wind down under Vietnamization. Casualties were politically unacceptable. The public back home was turning against the war. But the 1st Cavalry Division had an enormous area of operations to sanitize, and nowhere near enough men to do it. And the monsoon season was coming. Everything had to happen fast before the rains turned the jungle into an impassable swamp. Casey's solution? Change the game entirely. Instead of hunting the enemy, which had proven frustratingly ineffective because the NVA would simply fade away whenever confronted with superior American firepower, Casey decided to make the enemy come to them. His plan was simple and direct. The 1st Cavalry would bust some serious brush, as he put it. Battalions would hopscotch across Warzone C, setting up temporary fire support bases on, or very near known, NVA infiltration routes. These bases would be deliberately small, deliberately vulnerable-looking, irresistible targets. The North Vietnamese would see these little American outposts sitting out in the middle of nowhere and think, we can overrun that. They'd mass their forces, plan their attack, and come charging out of the jungle. That's when the trap would spring. The firebase would call in artillery from other bases. Cobra gunships would swoop in. Fast movers would drop their payloads. American firepower would annihilate the NVA forces that had been lured into the open. It was a decent strategy. It worked, overall. The 1st Cavalry never lost a firebase. But on a couple of occasions, it came very close to disaster. There was just one problem with Casey's plan. Using American troops as bait was specifically forbidden by the current rules of engagement. It was also something that was total anathema to the commanding general in Vietnam at the time, General Creighton Abrams. Abrams believed American soldiers should be protected, not dangled out as lures, but Casey was convinced his strategy would work, and Roberts gave him permission to implement it. So, the bases went up, small, temporary, vulnerable, and the NVA took the bait. Firebase J was attacked on March 29, 1970, just 6 miles from where Illingworth would be built. The defenders held, but barely. The NVA hit them hard, and casualties were severe. 3 days later, it would be Illingworth's turn. The men on these firebases understood what was happening. They knew they were bait. That's what makes their courage so remarkable. They weren't naive. They weren't ignorant of their role. They knew they'd been placed in harm's way deliberately to draw out the enemy, and they stayed anyway. They did their jobs anyway, because that's what soldiers do. But the resentment lingered. Decades later, at annual reunions at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, survivors still talk about it. We were nothing more than bait, they say. We were dangling out there like a piece of meat with no protection. And they're right. Fire support base. Illingworth was named for Corporal John James Illingworth of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry. He'd been killed on March 14, 1970, near Tay Ninh City, just 2 weeks before the firebase bearing his name was established. Illingworth had earned a posthumous Silver Star for rescuing an injured comrade under fire. The base itself was established on March 17, 1970, by the 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment. The location was deliberate, 35 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh, 5 kilometers from the Cambodian border, right astride a major NVA infiltration route. The firebase occupied a dried-up pond bed. It was flat, open, exposed. The jungle pressed in close on all sides, especially to the southwest. 20 bunkers were built into a 4-foot-high earthen berm that formed a rough circle. Inside that circle were the artillery pieces, the command post, the ammunition supplies, everything needed to make the firebase function. Lieutenant Colonel Michael J. Conrad commanded the firebase. At age 37, Conrad was a West Point graduate, class of 1956. He'd done well in his 13 years of commissioned service. He was smart, capable, respected by his superiors. The 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, was his first major combat command. He led about 650 men spread across 4 line companies, a headquarters company, and a reconnaissance platoon. Conrad was not happy about Illingworth. He'd walked the perimeter multiple times. He'd studied the terrain. He knew the Iskai's vulnerabilities. The firebase sat in a depression with the jungle rising slightly around it. Enemy troops could mass in that jungle, hidden by the vegetation, and the Americans wouldn't see them until they were practically on top of the base. There was no good fallback position, no reinforcements close enough to arrive quickly. The nearest friendly units were over 10 miles away, and there were no roads through the jungle. Conrad had made a controversial decision. He chose not to surround the firebase with concertina wire. His reasoning was sound. Wire wouldn't stop a determined enemy. It would just slow them down, maybe trip them up. But at night, in the chaos of combat, it could also slow down his own men if they needed to maneuver. So, no wire. Just claymore mines placed strategically outside the berm, ready to be detonated when the enemy approached. The defensive positions consisted of those 20 bunkers along the berm, manned primarily by Company C and the reconnaissance platoon from Company E. 4 M113 armored personnel carriers and 1 M551 Sheridan armored vehicle from Alpha Troop. 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment provided additional firepower. But here's the problem. Some of those armored vehicles were immobile, broken down. They could still shoot, but they couldn't move. Inside the perimeter, 3 separate artillery batteries provided the firebase's main firepower. B Battery, 1st Battalion, 77th Field Artillery. A battery, 1st Battalion, 30th Field Artillery. A battery, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery. Plus B Battery, 5th Battalion, 2nd Field Artillery. 6 100mm howitzers. 3 155mm howitzers. And 2 massive 8-inch howitzers. None of these units had worked together before. They'd been thrown together at Illingworth, an ad hoc collection of artillery batteries that barely knew each other's call signs. The artillerymen were trained to fire their guns, not to fight as infantry. But if the enemy got inside the wire, that's exactly what they'd have to do. Conrad requested that the firebase be relocated. He argued that the position was too vulnerable, too exposed. The jungle was too close. The terrain favored the enemy. He wanted Illingworth moved to more defensible ground. His request was denied. Instead, they sent him reinforcements. Company C, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry had been decimated on March 26th in an NVA bunker complex. Only 38 effective soldiers remained from a full-strength company. They were ordered to stand down at Illingworth, rest, and refit. 30 replacements arrived on March 30th. These were brand new soldiers, fresh from the States, who'd never seen combat. They had less than 24 hours to learn their jobs before the base was attacked. By the evening of March 31st, Conrad had approximately 220 men on the firebase, 2 understrength infantry companies, 80 artillerymen, a few tankers with immobile vehicles. That was it. And Conrad knew the enemy was out there. His Pipsy 5 ground surveillance radar had been picking up movement in the tree lines since before midnight. Lots of movement. The NVA were massing, swarming in the jungle, preparing for an assault. Conrad could practically feel them out there in the darkness, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He ordered his men to fire into the jungle, preemptive fire. Let the NVA know the Americans were awake, alert, ready. Cobra gunships swooped in and raked the tree line with rockets and minigun fire. Artillery from nearby bases, Firebase Hannis, Firebase St. Barbara, Camp Hazard, all opened up on pre-programmed coordinates designed to support Illingworth. Conrad unleashed his own 50 caliber machine guns and M60s, pouring fire directly into the trees. But the NVA didn't respond. They held their fire. They waited. They were patient. Conrad walked the perimeter again, with his radio telephone operator at his side. He wanted to make sure every bunker was ready, every man alert, every weapon loaded. He knew what was coming. The only question was when. At 2:15 in the morning on April 1st, Conrad returned to his Tactical Operations Center, the Tootsie, to try to catch a few minutes of rest. He lay down on his cot. He tried to sleep. It was impossible. His mind raced. 1,000 details. 1,000 worries. And then, at 2:17 a.m., he heard them. Faint whistles in the darkness, the bark of enemy artillery. Conrad leapt from his cot and tried to race outside. Bad move. He dove back into the talk as sheets of steel rained down on his firebase. The explosions ripped the night sky apart and enveloped the entire compound in deadly shards of red-hot metal. Fire Support Base Illingworth was under attack. Before we describe the battle, you need to know about some of the men who fought it. These weren't statistics. They weren't just numbers in a casualty report. They were real people. Young men, most of them barely out of high school, who found themselves in hell on earth. Captain John Ahern was the artillery liaison officer for the 1st Battalion, 77th Field Artillery. At 26 years old, Ahern was responsible for coordinating all artillery fire in support of Illingworth. That night, he would direct over 1,000 rounds of artillery, plus several airstrikes and dozens of gunship runs. He was the man who connected Illingworth to the outside world, who called down fire from heaven when the base needed it most. Sergeant Randall Richards was in the mortar platoon. He was one of the lucky ones. He would survive the battle physically unscathed, but he would never forget it. Decades later, Richards would say that April 1st of every year became "Thank God I'm Alive Day" for everyone who'd been at Illingworth. If you lived through that, he'd say, God had a reason for you living, and I hope you fulfilled the purpose God had for you. Sergeant Casey Waller, Sergeant Brent Street, and Corporal Nathan Mann were part of the reconnaissance platoon, Company E. All three would be killed in action that night. They would fight with extraordinary courage, and two of them, Waller and Street, would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Ralph Jones was an artilleryman with A Battery 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery. His unit operated two self-propelled 8-inch howitzers, massive guns that could fire shells 20 miles. But on March 31st, Division Artillery had delivered 40 tons of 8-inch ammunition to Illingworth. Nobody knew why. The firebase didn't need that much ammo. There wasn't time to dig proper storage pits, so the shells just sat there, stacked in the open in the center of the firebase, exposed and vulnerable. Jones and his buddies knew it was dangerous. From the first day, they had wanted to dig ammunition pits, using the 8-inch howitzers themselves as bulldozers to excavate safe storage bunkers underground. They were ordered not to waste time digging. Higher headquarters told them not to bother. The base was temporary, they'd be moving soon. Just stack the ammo and forget about it. We were dangling out there like a piece of bait with no protection, Jones would say years later. On April 1st, they hit us. And then there was Peter Charles Lemon. Lemon was special. Born in Toronto, Canada on June 5, 1950, he'd immigrated to the United States with his family when he was 2 years old. They settled in Tulsa City, Michigan. Lemon became a naturalized U.S. citizen at age 12. His father and uncles had all served in World War II in the Canadian military. So, military service was part of the family tradition. Lemon graduated from high school in 1968 and briefly worked in a factory before enlisting in the Army. By March 1970, at age 19, he was a specialist 4th class serving with Company E, the reconnaissance platoon, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry. He was an assistant machine gunner, one of the youngest men on the firebase. Lemon was also openly disenchanted with the war. He wasn't alone. Many soldiers in Vietnam by 1970 had lost faith in the mission. They didn't understand what they were fighting for anymore. American casualties were mounting. The public back home was turning against the war. And everybody knew Vietnamization meant the U.S. was pulling out. So what was the point? Like many soldiers, Lemon used marijuana to cope with the stress, the boredom, and the existential questions the war raised. It was readily available. Many soldiers partook. They'd sit around after missions, smoking grass, getting stoned, talking about when they'd get to go home. On the evening of March 31st, Lemon and his platoon returned to Illingworth after a reconnaissance patrol. They were exhausted. They'd been out in the jungle all day, looking for signs of enemy movement. Now they were back, and all Lemon wanted was some sleep. But the radar had picked up movement. Everyone was ordered to full alert. No sleep tonight. The enemy was out there. Lemon tried to relax. To help himself unwind, he smoked a joint with his buddies. Just a little marijuana to take the edge off, to calm his nerves, maybe to help him catch a few minutes of rest before the inevitable attack. He was still high when the battle began. Peter Lemon would earn the Medal of Honor that night, America's highest award for valor. He would become one of only 61 Canadians to receive the Medal of Honor, and the last Canadian to earn it. He would do it while wounded 3 times. He would do it while fighting hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers in pitch darkness. He would do it while so exhausted he could barely stand. And yes, he would do it while high on marijuana. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. March 31st, 1970. The last day of March, the last day of peace for Fire Support Base, Illingworth. The base was a hot, miserable little place. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. The dust was everywhere, coating everything, getting in your eyes, your mouth, your weapons. At night, the jungle came alive with sounds, animal calls, insect noises, the rustle of vegetation that might be wind or might be something else. The men of Illingworth went about their routines, guard duty, weapon maintenance, checking ammunition, burning human waste in the latrines, a job everyone hated but someone had to do. Some soldiers wrote letters home, some played cards, some just stared at the jungle and wondered when it would happen, because everyone knew it was coming. 3 companies were out on patrol that day, far enough from the base that they wouldn't be able to get back quickly if something happened. That left Charlie Company, the reconnaissance platoon, and the artillerymen to defend Illingworth. Just over 200 men. The 40 tons of 8-inch artillery shells sat in the center of the base, stacked on pallets, completely exposed. A disaster waiting to happen, but nobody did anything about it. There wasn't time. They'd be moving soon anyway. That's what they kept telling themselves. As evening approached, Lieutenant Colonel Conrad made his rounds again. He talked to his company commanders. He checked the defensive positions. He made sure the Claymore mines were properly placed and connected. He reviewed the fire support plan with Captain Ahern. If the NVA attacked, Illingworth would call down a storm of steel from the surrounding bases. The reconnaissance platoon returned from their patrol as darkness fell. They were tired, hungry, covered in dirt and sweat. Among them was Specialist Peter Lemon, assistant machine gunner, 19 years old, wondering what the hell he was doing in this miserable place. Just before midnight, the Pipsy 5, ground surveillance radar picked up movement, significant movement. The radar operator reported to Conrad. Enemy forces were massing in the tree line to the southwest. Lots of them. Moving around, preparing, getting into position. Conrad didn't hesitate. He ordered preemptive fires. Hit them before they hit us. Make them know we're ready. The Cobra gunships screamed in, their rotors beating the air, their miniguns howling like banshees. Rockets streaked from their pods and exploded in the jungle. Tracer rounds carved red lines through the darkness. The noise was deafening. Artillery from Firebase Hannes, 4 kilometers south, opened up. 105mm shells screamed overhead and impacted in the jungle. Firebase St. Barbara joined in. Camp Hazard added their guns to the chorus. The Americans were putting out a massive volume of fire, trying to disrupt the enemy's preparations, trying to inflict casualties before the assault even began. Conrad ordered his own weapons to fire. The 50 caliber machine guns opened up, their heavy rounds tearing through the foliage. M60 machine guns added their lighter, faster fire. Mortars dropped illumination rounds, trying to light up the jungle, trying to see what was out there. But the NVA didn't respond. They absorbed the fire. They took their casualties. They waited. The Americans fired for 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then silence. Wait and see. Are they still out there? Did we stop them? Did we hurt them enough to make them reconsider? Conrad ordered everyone to remain alert. No one sleeps tonight. Every bunker, every fighting position, fully manned. If they come, we'll be ready. The hours crawled by. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Peter Lemon stood at his position on the northern perimeter. His machine gun was ready. His M16 rifle was loaded. His grenades were within easy reach. He was still feeling the effects of the marijuana he'd smoked earlier, but he was alert. The adrenaline had kicked in. He knew what was coming. Around the perimeter, 220 young Americans waited in the darkness. Some prayed, some thought about home, about their families, about their girlfriends. Some thought about nothing at all, just focused on the moment, on staying alive. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad stood in his tactical operations center, listening to radio reports, watching his maps, trying to anticipate what the enemy would do. He knew they were out there. The radar showed them. They hadn't left. They were waiting for something. 2:15 a.m. Conrad decided to try to rest, just a few minutes. He lay down on his cot, closed his eyes, tried to quiet his racing mind. It didn't work. He tossed and turned. Too much adrenaline, too many worries. 2:17 a.m. The whistles came first, faint, distant, barely audible over the jungle sounds. Then the bark of enemy artillery, that distinctive sound that every combat veteran knows, that makes your blood run cold and your muscles tense, and your mind scream, "Incoming!" Conrad leaped up. He ran for the door of the TOC. The world exploded. Over 300 rounds. That's how many mortar shells, rockets, and recoilless rifle rounds hit Fire Support Base Illingworth in the first 20 minutes of the attack. 300 rounds slamming into an area about the size of 2 football fields. 1 every 4 seconds. The noise was unimaginable. Each explosion shook the ground. Each blast sent shrapnel whining through the air. The concussions hit you in the chest like physical blows. The dust rose in choking clouds. The smoke burned your eyes and throat. Conrad dove back into his talk as the first salvo hit. Shells impacted all around the command post. The ground heaved. The building shook. Sandbags burst. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The Fire Direction Center for the 32nd Artillery took a direct hit. 3 off-duty radio men, sleeping nearby, were killed instantly. The 77th Fire Direction Center was hit several times. 7 men died in those first moments. The communication tower was struck by a rocket. Long-distance communications were severed. Conrad was cut off from division headquarters, from the other fire bases, from the outside world. But Captain Ahern, thinking fast, managed to raise a Cobra helicopter circling overhead. The pilot set up a relay. Now Conrad could communicate through the helicopter. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The North Vietnamese bombardment was methodical, devastating, professional. They'd planned this attack carefully. They knew exactly where to aim. The fire direction centers, the command post, the ammunition storage areas. They were trying to destroy Illingworth's ability to coordinate, to communicate, to fight back. And it was working. On the northern perimeter, where the reconnaissance platoon held the line, the bombardment was particularly intense. Shells walked up and down the berm, seeking out the bunkers, trying to collapse them, trying to kill the defenders before the ground assault even began. Peter Lemon crouched in his position, hands over his ears, mouth open to equalize the pressure from the concussions. His machine gun was beside him. His assistant gunner was there too. They couldn't see anything. The dust from the explosions filled the air, turning night into an impenetrable brown fog. And then, exactly 20 minutes after the bombardment began, it stopped. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Ears ringing, hearts pounding, hands shaking. Conrad grabbed his radio. "All positions, report." The reports came in, broken, frightened, but determined. Casualties, lots of casualties. But the perimeter was still intact. The bunkers were damaged, but not destroyed. The men were shaken, but still fighting. And then they heard the bugles. That's how the North Vietnamese army signaled an assault. Bugles. The sound was eerie, otherworldly, something out of another century. But it meant one thing. They were coming. Out of the jungle, out of the dust and smoke, came the enemy. 400 soldiers from the 272nd Maine Force Regiment, 9th Piavin Division. They'd been waiting in the tree line, enduring the American preemptive fire, taking casualties but staying in position. Now it was their turn. They came in waves of about 40 men each. They charged toward the American positions, firing as they ran. AK-47 rounds cracked through the air. RPGs whooshed from their launchers and exploded against the berm. Satchel charges sailed through the darkness, timed to detonate when they hit the bunkers. The Americans opened fire. Machine guns hammered. M16s crackled. M60s roared. Claymore mines detonated, sending 700 steel balls each into the charging enemy ranks. The 50 caliber guns swung toward the assault, their heavy rounds punching through multiple bodies. The 105mm howitzers depressed their barrels to point-blank range and fired beehive rounds, giant shotgun shells packed with thousands of tiny steel flechettes. Men fell. Both sides, Americans in their bunkers, hit by enemy fire. North Vietnamese in the open, cut down by the defensive fires. But the dust from the bombardment was everywhere. It hung in the air like a fog, and it was getting into everything, into the mechanisms of the M16 rifles, into the workings of the M60 machine guns. The weapons started to jam. This was one of the M16's most notorious problems in Vietnam. The rifle worked beautifully in clean conditions, but introduced dust, dirt, moisture, anything that could gum up the works, and it became unreliable. You'd fire half a magazine, and suddenly the rifle would stop. Failure to eject, failure to feed. The bolt wouldn't cycle properly, and you'd be standing there with a useless piece of metal and plastic while the enemy charged toward you. That's what happened on the northern perimeter of Fire Support Base Illingworth. Peter Lemon's machine gun jammed. He tried to clear it. No good. The dust had fouled the mechanism. He grabbed his M16, fired a burst. It jammed too. Now he was unarmed, except for his grenades. All along the northern berm, soldiers were screaming in frustration. "My gun's jammed! I can't clear it! Need a weapon!" Some soldiers used their jammed rifles as clubs, swinging them at the enemy soldiers who were suddenly at the berm, climbing over, getting inside the perimeter. Others grabbed grenades, pulled the pins, threw them as fast as they could. This was no longer a firefight. This was a brawl, a desperate, brutal hand-to-hand struggle for survival. Peter Lemon stood on the northern perimeter, his weapons useless, and grabbed his grenades. The official Medal of Honor citation describes what happened next in formal military language. But let's tell it the way it really happened. Lemon started throwing grenades, one after another. Pull the pin, count to 2, throw. The enemy was close. Maybe 30 feet away, maybe 20. Hard to tell in the dust and darkness. But he could see their muzzle flashes. He could hear them shouting. So he threw grenades toward the sound, toward the flashes. The grenades worked. Bodies fell. The assault in his sector faltered, but not for long. More enemy soldiers appeared out of the dust cloud. They were inside the perimeter now. Some had climbed over the berm at points where all the defenders were dead or wounded. They were spreading out, attacking from multiple directions. Lemon threw his last grenade. Now what? A North Vietnamese soldier materialized out of the dust, right in front of him, close enough to touch. The enemy soldier had an AK-47. Lemon had nothing but his jammed rifle. He didn't think. He just reacted. He swung the M16 like a baseball bat and clubbed the enemy soldier in the head. The man went down. Fragment wounds. That's what the citation says next. Lemon was hit by grenade fragments. Shrapnel tore into his body. Multiple wounds. He went down, bleeding, disoriented from the blast. But he got back up. This is the part that's hard to understand unless you've been in combat. The human body is capable of extraordinary things when survival is on the line. Lemon was wounded. He was in pain. He was bleeding. He was still feeling the effects of the marijuana he had smoked hours earlier. He was exhausted. He'd been fighting for his life in the darkness and chaos. And he got back up and kept fighting. He saw his machine gunner partner, wounded, unable to move. Lemon grabbed him and dragged him back to an aid station, bullets cracking through the air around them. Explosions still rocking the firebase. He got his friend to safety. Then he turned around and headed back to the fighting. Someone handed him a bag of grenades. Lemon took them and moved forward to where the fighting was hottest. He could see enemy soldiers moving through the firebase, firing, throwing satchel charges, trying to reach the artillery pieces and destroy them. He started throwing grenades again, one after another, methodical, determined. He was wounded, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His friends were dying. His unit was being overrun. He had to do something. The enemy assault intensified. They were pushing hard on the northern perimeter, trying to break through completely, trying to get to the command post and the artillery fire direction centers. Lemon saw a section of the perimeter about to be overrun. No defenders left alive. Enemy soldiers climbing over the berm. He moved toward it, throwing grenades, trying to stop them alone. He ran out of grenades again. Now he was unarmed, wounded, exhausted. But the enemy was right there, climbing over the berm, and someone had to stop them. Peter Lemon started fighting with his bare hands. The Medal of Honor citation doesn't give details about this part. It just says he engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. But survivors remember. They saw this. 19-year-old Canadian kid, wounded and bleeding, punching enemy soldiers, wrestling with them, keeping them from breaching the perimeter through sheer determination and physical courage. He somehow fought them off, all of them, one after another. He knocked them down, pushed them back, held that section of the perimeter alone, and then he found another machine gun, someone's weapon, abandoned or dropped by a casualty. Lemon grabbed it, checked that it worked, and opened fire. He stood fully exposed on top of the berm, silhouetted against the explosions and fires, and poured machine gun fire into the enemy assault. He fired until the barrel glowed red. He fired until the gun ran out of ammunition. He fired until he collapsed from his wounds and exhaustion. That's when they finally got him to an aid station. He was protesting, insisting other men needed help more than he did. He tried to refuse evacuation. The medics had to practically force him into the helicopter when it arrived at dawn. Peter Charles Lemon would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. President Richard Nixon would present it to him at the White House on June 15, 1971. Lemon initially considered declining the award. He felt it rightfully belonged to his three friends who'd been killed in the battle: Sergeant Casey Waller, Private First Class Nathan Mann, Specialist Brent Street. But he accepted it, not for himself, for them. Years later, Lemon would wear his Medal of Honor to honor the memory of the men who didn't come home from Illingworth. He dedicated the medal to those three friends. Their names are inscribed with his in the records of valor. Peter Lemon survived Fire Support Base Illingworth. He survived Vietnam. He left the Army in 1972, went to college, earned a bachelor's degree from Colorado State University, and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Northern Colorado. He settled in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and dedicated his life to honoring the men who fought beside him that April night. A portion of a highway in Michigan that runs through his hometown was named in his honor in 2020. In 2005, he donated his Medal of Honor to his former high school to inspire students. He was 19 years old when he earned America's highest award for valor. And yes, he was high on marijuana when he did it. While Peter Lemon was fighting his desperate battle on the northern perimeter, something even more catastrophic was about to happen in the center of Fire Support Base Illingworth. Remember those 40 tons of 8-inch artillery shells? The ammunition that had been delivered the day before the attack? The shells that were sitting in the open, stacked on pallets, completely exposed? A North Vietnamese sapper, one of the enemy soldiers who'd infiltrated the firebase during the assault, threw a satchel charge near that ammunition dump. The charge exploded. It set off sympathetic detonations in the ammunition. Fire spread rapidly through the stacked shells. The artillerymen saw it happening. They tried to fight the fire. They tried to move the ammunition. But there wasn't time. At 3:18 a.m., approximately 1 hour after the attack began, the ammunition exploded. Survivors described it as a titanic roar. The ground lifted. Everyone on the firebase was thrown into the air by the concussion. The blast wave was powerful enough to knock men off their feet 100 meters away. The flash lit up the jungle for miles around. 190 rounds of 8-inch high explosive shells, all detonating simultaneously. The energy released was equivalent to a small tactical nuclear weapon. The explosion tore a massive hole in the berm on the northern side of the firebase. Shrapnel sprayed in every direction, killing and wounding soldiers on both sides. The blast stunned everyone, Americans and North Vietnamese alike. For a moment, the entire battle stopped. Men lay on the ground, ears ringing, unable to hear, unable to think. The dust from the explosion was so thick, it was like being inside a brown cloud. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Ralph Jones, the artilleryman who'd wanted to dig proper ammunition pits, was knocked unconscious by the blast. When he came to, his 8-inch howitzer was wrecked, destroyed by shrapnel from the exploding ammunition. His gunner was dead. His loader was wounded. The firebase was in chaos. The explosion had done exactly what the North Vietnamese wanted. It had devastated the Americans' defensive capability. But it had also hurt the NVA assault. Enemy soldiers caught in the blast radius were killed or wounded. The shock wave disrupted their formation. Their officers, those who survived, had to regroup, reassess, figure out what had just happened. Conrad, in his tactical operations center, felt the explosion shake the building. Debris rained down. Radios sparked and failed. He grabbed his helmet and ran outside to see what had happened. The scene was apocalyptic. The center of his firebase was simply gone, replaced by a crater. Fire burned everywhere. Men were screaming. Some were wandering around in shock. Others were frantically trying to help the wounded. But the perimeter. Conrad had to know about the perimeter. Were they still holding? Had the explosion created a gap the enemy could exploit? He grabbed his radio. "All positions, report, status." The reports came in slowly. Many positions didn't respond. Their radios were destroyed, or the men were dead, or they were too busy fighting to answer. But gradually, Conrad pieced together what was happening. The northern perimeter had been hit hardest by the explosion. The blast had torn a section of the berm completely apart. Enemy soldiers were pushing toward that gap, trying to exploit it, trying to pour through and get into the firebase's interior. But Company C, those men who'd been decimated just days before, who'd received replacement soldiers just hours before the attack, those men held the line. They moved forward from their secondary positions and filled the gap. They stood in the hole blown by the explosion and fought hand-to-hand with the enemy, trying to break through. Captain Ahern, the artillery liaison officer, was on the radio, calling fire mission after fire mission. Firebase Hannes responded. Firebase St. Barbara responded. Artillery rounds screamed overhead and impacted beyond the perimeter, hitting the enemy assembly areas, disrupting their reinforcements, preventing fresh NVA soldiers from joining the assault. The Cobra gunships overhead fired their last rockets and minigun rounds, then radioed that they were Winchester, out of ammunition. They flew back to rearm and refuel. New Cobras arrived to take their place. An AC-119 Stinger gunship, call sign Spooky, orbited overhead. The pilot radioed down. "Illingworth, this is Spooky. We see you. We're standing by." That gunship would save lives over the next hours, providing close air support in the darkness. Its twin 20mm cannons and its miniguns putting out devastating firepower. The battle raged on. The ammunition explosion changed everything. It should have ended the battle. It should have broken the American defense completely. That's what the North Vietnamese expected. That's why they'd targeted the ammunition dump. Destroy the Americans' ability to fight back, then overwhelm the survivors. But it didn't work out that way. Yes, the explosion devastated Illingworth. Yes, it killed and wounded dozens of Americans. Yes, it created a gap in the perimeter that the enemy tried to exploit. But it also hurt the NVA assault badly. Their soldiers who'd gotten closest to the ammunition dump were killed by the blast. The shockwave disrupted their formations. And the American survivors, instead of panicking and running, filled the gaps and kept fighting. That's the thing about American soldiers. They're trained to adapt. When things go to hell, they don't quit. They figure it out. They improvise. All across the firebase, artillerymen who'd never trained for infantry combat grabbed rifles and fought like infantrymen. Tank crews whose vehicles couldn't move used their weapons as stationary gun platforms. Cooks and clerks and radio operators picked up weapons from casualties and joined the defense. Everyone fought. The battle had devolved into something primal. With so many weapons jammed from the dust, soldiers fought with whatever they could find. Rifle butts became clubs. Entrenching tools became axes. Some men fought with knives, some with their bare hands. Staff Sergeant John Nayland, who would survive to attend reunions 50 years later, described it as the most terrifying experience of his life. "You couldn't see more than 5 feet in that dust," he said. "You didn't know if the guy next to you was American or NVA until you were close. Enough to touch him, it was just chaos, pure chaos." The North Vietnamese kept coming, wave after wave. They'd committed to this assault. They'd planned it carefully. They'd brought 400 soldiers, a full battalion, to overrun this little fire base. They weren't going to give up just because the Americans were fighting back harder than expected. But the Americans had one crucial advantage: firepower. Captain Ahern, that artillery liaison officer, was performing miracles. Despite the chaos, despite the damaged radios, despite the communications difficulties, he kept calling in fire missions. Firebase Hannes, 4 kilometers south. Firebase St. Barbara, Camp Hazard. All of them were firing in support of Illingworth, dropping high explosive shells into the jungle around the base, hitting the NVA assembly areas, preventing reinforcements from reaching the assault force. Ahern directed over 1,000 rounds of artillery that night. 1,000 rounds. Each one carefully plotted, carefully aimed, to hit the enemy without hitting friendly forces. In the darkness and confusion of that battle, that was an extraordinary feat of skill and courage. And then there were the helicopter pilots. Captain Joe Hogg, flying a Cobra gunship, made multiple gun runs over the firebase. His helicopter was hit by enemy fire repeatedly. Hydraulic fluid leaked. Control systems failed. But Hogg kept flying, kept shooting, kept providing that crucial fire support. More than that, when Conrad's communications were knocked out, Hogg's helicopter became the radio relay between Illingworth and the outside world. Without Hogg, Illingworth would have been completely isolated. On the ground, the fighting continued. bunker to bunker, position to position. Sometimes the Americans would drive the enemy back. Sometimes the NVA would push forward and capture a section of the perimeter. Then the Americans would counterattack and take it back. Lieutenant Gregory Peters commanded the reconnaissance platoon. These were his men on the northern perimeter, who were taking the brunt of the assault. Peters moved from position to position under fire, encouraging his troops, redistributing ammunition, helping evacuate the wounded. When one bunker was about to be overrun, Peters personally led a counterattack with grenades and rifle fire, driving the enemy back. The noise was constant. Explosions, gunfire, screaming, orders being shouted, the wounded calling for medics, the dying calling for their mothers. And underneath it all, those eerie enemy bugles still sounding in the darkness, calling the NVA soldiers forward, urging them to press the attack. Time lost all meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Men fought on adrenaline and fear and determination. There was no thought of victory, no grand strategy, just survival, just making it through the next minute, the next second. The wounded were everywhere. Medics moved through the chaos, doing what they could, but there were so many casualties. Some wounds were immediately fatal. Some men bled out before they could be reached. Others were wounded multiple times, hit again and again, but kept fighting because there was no choice. And still, the North Vietnamese came. Their officers were pushing them forward, threatening them, ordering them to break through at any cost. The NVA had committed to this assault. They'd hit Firebase J 3 days ago. Now they were hitting Illingworth. This was part of a larger offensive, a coordinated attack across South Vietnam. On April 1st, 1970, the NVA launched attacks on over 100 American and ARVN positions throughout the country. Illingworth was just one target among many, but it was the one that mattered most to the men fighting there. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, approximately 2 hours after the battle began, something shifted. The NVA assault began to lose momentum. Their casualties were mounting. They'd expected to overrun Illingworth quickly, especially after the ammunition explosion. But the Americans were still fighting, still holding. The enemy attacks became less coordinated. Instead of organized waves, it was now small groups probing the perimeter, looking for weak spots. The Americans could hear their officers out in the jungle, shouting, trying to rally their troops, trying to organize one more push. But it didn't come. The will wasn't there anymore. The NVA soldiers had fought hard. They'd taken terrible casualties. The American firepower, both from Illingworth itself and from the supporting bases, had torn them apart. And now, with dawn approaching, they knew their time was running out. Once the sun came up, American air power would dominate. Jets would arrive, attack helicopters, medevac birds. The NVA couldn't fight that. The enemy attacks tapered off. Sporadic fire continued. Enemy soldiers still in the wire kept shooting. But the mass assaults were over. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad, standing in the ruined talk, checking his watch, realized something important. They'd held. Illingworth had survived, battered, bloodied, but not broken. Dawn was coming. The first light of day revealed a scene of absolute devastation. Fire support. Base. Illingworth looked like the surface of the moon. The crater where the ammunition had been was 30 feet across. The earthen berm was torn apart in multiple places. Bunkers were collapsed. Equipment was destroyed. Burning debris littered the ground. The dust was beginning to settle, revealing the full extent of the carnage. And the bodies. American and North Vietnamese, lying where they'd fallen. Some in the wire, some on the berm, some inside the perimeter. The dead were mixed together, friend and enemy, united in death, if not in life. The surviving defenders of Illingworth looked like zombies. They were covered in dirt, blood, dust. Many were wounded. All were exhausted. They moved slowly, methodically, checking the perimeter, making sure no enemy soldiers remained alive inside the wire, securing weapons, looking for wounded who could still be saved. The enemy fire had stopped. The North Vietnamese army had withdrawn, fading back into the jungle, carrying their wounded and as many of their dead as they could. But they'd left bodies behind. Lots of bodies. American patrols moved cautiously outside the perimeter. They found 74 dead NVA soldiers. That was just the confirmed body count. the ones the Americans could physically touch and verify. The actual enemy casualties were certainly higher. Blood trails led off into the jungle. Drag marks showed where bodies had been pulled away. The NVA never left accurate casualty figures, but estimates suggested they'd lost over 100 killed and probably 200 or more wounded, a casualty rate of over 50% for the attacking force. The cost to the Americans was severe: 24 dead, 54 wounded. Those numbers would vary slightly in different reports. Some accounts say 25 dead, some say 58 wounded, but the bottom line was the same: 40% casualties. Nearly half of everyone on the fire base was either killed or wounded. Conrad moved through the base, checking on his men, coordinating with the medevac helicopters that were beginning to arrive. The first birds came in around 5 a.m., just as the sun was rising. They loaded the most seriously wounded first. Multiple trips, more helicopters, the urgent cases, then the priority cases, then the routine cases. It took hours to evacuate everyone who needed medical attention. Peter Lemon was still protesting when they loaded him on a helicopter. "I'm fine," he insisted. "Other guys need this more than I do." The medics ignored him. He had multiple fragment wounds. He'd been fighting for 3 hours straight. He'd collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. He was going to the hospital, whether he liked it or not. As the medevac helicopters departed, carrying the wounded to safety, reinforcements began to arrive. Elements of the 11th Armored Cavalry had been fighting their way through the jungle all night, trying to reach Illingworth, trying to provide relief. They finally broke through around 5 in the morning, their tanks and armored cavalry assault vehicles crashing through the underbrush, their guns ready to take on any remaining enemy forces. But the enemy was gone. The NVA had pulled back across the border into Cambodia, out of reach, back to their sanctuaries where American forces couldn't officially pursue them. They'd lick their wounds, replace their casualties, and prepare for the next battle. Later that morning, around 9 or 10 o'clock, a UH-1 Huey helicopter circled the fire base and landed. Out stepped Major General L.V. Roberts, commander of the 1st Cavalry Division. He'd come to see the damage for himself, to talk to the survivors, to honor the defenders of Illingworth. Roberts walked the perimeter with Conrad. He saw the crater. He saw the destroyed bunkers. He saw the blood-stained ground. He saw his young soldiers, dirty and exhausted, still holding their weapons, still on alert. Roberts awarded a Silver Star on the spot to one deserving soldier. Then he made an announcement that the men didn't want to hear. "You'll get a hot meal," Roberts promised, "and then you're staying here one more night." The collective groan was almost audible. Stay here? After what they'd just been through? Stay at this death trap for another night? But orders were orders. The firebase was too important to abandon immediately. The NVA might come back. The position had to be held. Sergeant Randall Richards, decades later, would laugh about it. When the general said that, it was just like, "Man, the army strikes again. We were tired and hungry, but we stayed. And we would have fought them again if they would have come back." The men of Illingworth spent April 1st cleaning up, repairing the perimeter, redistributing ammunition, preparing for a second assault that never came. The NVA didn't return. They'd had enough. The cost of attacking Illingworth had been too high. On April 2nd, 1970, Fire Support Base Illingworth was abandoned. The artillery pieces were hooked up to trucks and towed away. The remaining equipment was loaded onto helicopters. The bunkers were destroyed. The Americans left nothing behind that the enemy could use. Within hours, the jungle began to reclaim the site. Within weeks, you could barely tell there'd been a fire base there at all. Today, the location of Fire Support Base Illingworth is just another clearing in the jungle, a peaceful field where nothing remains but faint traces of earthworks and the memories of the men who fought there. Let's talk about the men who died at Fire Support Base Illingworth. They deserve more than just a number. They deserve to be remembered. Sergeant Casey O. Waller, Sergeant Brent A. Street, Corporal Nathan J. Mann. All three from the Reconnaissance Platoon, Company E. All three would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. They fought beside Peter Lemon on that northern perimeter. They held the line when it seemed impossible. They gave their lives so their fellow soldiers could survive. Specialist Billy P. Carlisle, Specialist Michael R. Patterson, Specialist Klaus D. Schlieben, Private First Class Roger J. McInerney, young men, most barely out of high school, who'd been sent to a firebase that was deliberately placed in harm's way. Sergeant David G. Dragosevac, Sergeant Sidney E. Plattenberger, Staff Sergeant Gerald W. Purdon. NCOs, the backbone of any military unit, who led their men with courage and died doing their duty. The 3 radio men killed in the fire direction center of the 32nd Artillery when that first shell hit. The 7 men killed in the 77th Fire Direction Center. The artillerymen killed when the ammunition exploded. The infantrymen killed on the perimeter. The soldiers killed trying to help the wounded. 24 names, 24 American families who received the telegram they dreaded. 24 mothers who buried their sons. 24 sets of friends and girlfriends and brothers and sisters who had to learn to live with the loss. Their names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Panel 9W and 10W, depending on the date they died. Every year on April 1st, survivors of Illingworth visit that wall. They find those names. They touch the polished black granite. They remember. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, there's a monument dedicated to the soldiers who died at Fire Support Base Illingworth. It's located at Constitution Park near Courage Drive. The monument lists all their names, their ranks, their units. Every year, on April 1st, veterans gather there for a ceremony. They raise the flag, they salute their fallen brothers, they share stories, they cry, they laugh, they remember. The reunions are getting smaller each year. In 2022, for the 52nd anniversary, only 2 survivors were able to attend. Retired Captain John Ahern and retired Staff Sergeant John Nayland, both living in San Antonio. They're in their 70s now, getting older. The years take their toll. Each year we try to gather here to remember our fallen brothers, Ahern said at that ceremony. But each year there are less and less of us. That's the reality of time. The Vietnam War ended 50 years ago. The men who fought it are dying of old age now. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was like on Fire Support Base Illingworth that night. No one who can tell the story from personal experience. That's why the story must be told now. That's why it must be recorded, preserved, remembered. The wounded from Illingworth face their own battles after the war. Physical wounds heal, mostly. But the psychological wounds, those last forever. Post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, depression, anxiety, nightmares about the battle, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance. Many of the Illingworth survivors struggled when they came home. America in 1970 wasn't friendly to Vietnam veterans. There were no welcome home parades, no crowds cheering. In many cases, veterans were treated with hostility, blamed for a war they didn't start and couldn't control. Some turned to alcohol, some turned to drugs. Some isolated themselves from society, unable to relate to people who hadn't experienced what they'd experienced. Some marriages failed. Some careers never got started. The visible wounds from Illingworth healed. The invisible wounds remained. But many of the survivors also found purpose in their pain. They became advocates for veterans' rights. They helped other veterans struggling with PTSD. They told their stories to schools, to civic groups, to anyone who would listen. They made sure that the sacrifice of their fallen brothers wasn't forgotten. Peter Lemon, the Medal of Honor recipient, dedicated his life to honoring the men who died beside him. He speaks at schools. He attends veteran events. He wears his medal proudly now, not for himself, but for Casey Waller, Nathan Mann, and Brent Street, the 3 friends who didn't come home. Ralph Jones, the artilleryman who'd wanted to dig ammunition pits, spent decades processing his anger about what happened. He'd been right. The ammunition should have been buried. Lives could have been saved. But he eventually found peace by connecting with other survivors, by sharing their stories, by ensuring that future generations of soldiers would learn from the mistakes made at Illingworth. The survivors created bonds that transcended normal friendship. When you fought together, bled together, nearly died together, you're connected for life. The Illingworth veterans became a family. They stayed in touch. They visited each other. They attended reunions. They supported each other through the difficult times. And every April 1st they remember. They raise a glass to their fallen brothers. They tell the stories again. They make sure the sacrifice is never forgotten. The courage displayed at Fire Support Base Illingworth did not go unrecognized. The Army awarded 1 Medal of Honor, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, multiple Silver Stars, dozens of Bronze Stars, scores of Army Commendation Medals, and over 100 Purple Hearts for the battle. Peter Charles Lemon received the Medal of Honor from President Richard Nixon on June 15, 1971, during a ceremony at the White House. Lemon was 21 years old, having just celebrated his birthday 10 days earlier. His family attended the ceremony. Nixon greeted the young soldier and proclaimed him a hero for his actions. But Lemon struggled with the award initially. He considered declining it. He felt it belonged to his 3 friends who died, not to him. He'd just been doing his job, he said. Everyone at Illingworth had been doing their job. Why should he be singled out? Eventually, he accepted the medal, but with the understanding that it represented all the men of Illingworth, especially those who didn't survive. He dedicated it to Casey Waller, Nathan Mann, and Brent Street. Their sacrifice made his survival possible. For many years after receiving the Medal of Honor, Lemon didn't wear it. He kept it in a shoebox. He was disillusioned with the war, disappointed by the way veterans were treated, angry about the bait strategy that had put him and his friends in that situation. The medal represented recognition from a government he felt had used him and his fellow soldiers as expendable pawns. But as the years passed, Lemon's perspective changed. He realized that the medal wasn't about politics. It wasn't about the government's strategy. It was about the men he'd fought beside. It was a symbol of their courage, their sacrifice, their brotherhood. So he started wearing it. Not for himself, for them. Sergeant Casey Waller and Sergeant Brent Street were both posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Both had fought with exceptional courage on the northern perimeter. Both had held their positions against overwhelming odds. Both had inspired their fellow soldiers by their example. Both gave their lives for their country. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Conrad received the Silver Star for his leadership during the battle, his cool-headed command, his ability to coordinate the defense under chaotic conditions, his courage under fire, all contributed to Illingworth's survival. Conrad would go on to have a distinguished military career. Within a year of Illingworth, he was promoted to full colonel. He eventually made brigadier general, then major general. He returned to command the 1st Cavalry Division, the same division he'd served with at Illingworth. He retired with honor, his reputation as a combat leader firmly established. Captain John Ahern, the artillery liaison officer who directed over 1,000 rounds of supporting fire, received recognition for his actions. Multiple other officers and NCOs received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for their courage and leadership. The helicopter pilots who supported Illingworth that night also received awards. Captain Joe Hogg, the Cobra pilot who'd maintained the communications relay and made multiple gun runs despite his damaged helicopter, received recognition for his valor. The AC-119 gunship crew, the medevac pilots who flew into a hot landing zone at dawn to evacuate the wounded, all performed with exceptional courage. Company C, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, the unit that had suffered so terribly just days before Illingworth, and then fought so magnificently during the battle, received unit citations for their performance. These young soldiers, many of them brand new replacements who had been at the firebase less than 24 hours before the attack, had proven themselves in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers themselves. The bonds they formed, the mutual respect, the knowledge that they'd faced the worst together and survived. No medal can capture that. No award can fully represent what they went through. Every survivor of Illingworth can say they fought in one of the most intense small unit actions of the entire Vietnam War. They can say they held their ground against a numerically superior enemy. They can say they did their duty with courage and honor. And they can say they survived the deadliest day of the deadliest month of 1970. Now we need to talk about the elephant in the room. The bait strategy, the deliberate placement of American soldiers in vulnerable positions to lure out the enemy. Was it justified? Was it ethical? Was it worth the cost? This is the question that haunts the survivors of Fire Support Base Illingworth to this day. Bait, we were nothing more than bait. That's what they say. Decades later, that resentment is still there, still raw, still painful, and they're not wrong. Fire support base. Illingworth was deliberately placed in a vulnerable position on a known NVA infiltration route. The base was made to look small, isolated, tempting. The goal was to draw out enemy forces so American firepower could destroy them. In military terms, it's called shaping operations, creating conditions that force the enemy to react in ways that favor your strategy. But the men on the firebase weren't abstract tactical pieces. They were real people, young men with families, with futures, with lives ahead of them. And they were put in danger deliberately. Brigadier General George Casey's strategy worked, in the larger sense. The 1st Cavalry did identify enemy positions. They did draw out NVA forces. They did inflict heavy casualties on the enemy. The fire bases served their purpose. But the cost was high. Very high. The official rules of engagement in Vietnam specifically prohibited using American troops as bait. General Creighton Abrams, the overall commander in Vietnam, was opposed to such tactics. He believed American soldiers should be protected, not deliberately exposed to danger. So how did Casey get away with it? The answer is complicated. Casey was a brilliant officer, a rising star, widely respected. He had the support of his immediate superior, Major General L.V. Roberts. Casey argued that his strategy was about force protection, not using troops as bait. By establishing fire bases and drawing the enemy to them, he was choosing the battlefield, fighting on terms favorable to American firepower, rather than chasing the enemy through the jungle where they held the advantage. It was a fine distinction, a semantic argument, but it allowed the strategy to proceed. The results were mixed. Firebase J was attacked and held, but with heavy casualties. Firebase Illingworth was attacked and held, but with 40% casualties. Other fire bases were probed, but not seriously assaulted. Overall, the strategy did achieve its objectives. The NVA was forced to reveal their positions and strengths. American intelligence gained valuable information about enemy dispositions. When the Cambodian incursion began in May 1970, the 1st Cavalry knew where to strike, because Casey's firebase strategy had mapped out enemy locations. But was it worth it? Was the intelligence gained worth the lives lost? That's a question that can't be answered objectively. If you're a strategic planner looking at maps and casualty figures, you might say yes. The cost-benefit analysis favors the strategy. You inflicted heavier casualties on the enemy than you suffered. You gained valuable intelligence. You disrupted enemy operations. Success. But if you're one of the soldiers who was on that firebase, who saw your friends die, who nearly died yourself, who still has nightmares 50 years later, you might feel differently. You might feel like you were used, like your life was considered expendable, like you were a pawn in a game played by generals who never had to face the consequences of their decisions. Both perspectives are valid. War is like that. It forces impossible choices. Commanders have to balance the tactical necessity against the human cost. Sometimes there are no good options. Sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Conrad requested that Illingworth be relocated to more defensible ground. He saw the vulnerabilities. He knew the risks. His request was denied. He was told to make do with what he had. So he did. He prepared as best he could. He positioned his forces intelligently. He coordinated his supporting fires. He did everything a good commander should do. And when the attack came, he led his men with courage and skill. He held his fire base. He accomplished his mission. By any objective military standard, Mike Conrad was successful at Illingworth. But he also lost 24 men. 54 more were wounded. Almost half his force became casualties in a single night. That's something a commander never forgets, never fully recovers from. Even if it wasn't his fault, even if he did everything right, the weight of those losses stays with you forever. Conrad's career prospered after Illingworth. He made general, he commanded divisions, he received awards and recognition. But in quiet moments, he surely thought about those 24 soldiers, wondered if there was something more he could have done, some way he could have saved more of them. That's the burden of command. General George Casey never had to answer for his strategy. He was promoted to Major General in late April 1970. He assumed command of the entire 1st Cavalry Division in May. And then, on July 7, 1970, he was killed in a helicopter crash while flying to visit wounded soldiers. He died doing what good leaders do, caring for his men. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Casey's son, George Casey Jr., would follow his father into the Army. He would eventually become a 4-star general and serve as the Army Chief of Staff from 2007 to 2011. The younger Casey has spoken about his father's death, about growing up in a military family, about the sacrifices military families make. The elder Casey's legacy lives on through his son's distinguished service. But the question remains, was the Firebase bait strategy justified? Military historians still debate it. Some argue it was a necessary tactical innovation during a difficult period of the war. Vietnamization was beginning. American forces were drawing down. Creative strategies were needed to accomplish objectives with fewer troops. The Firebase strategy achieved results. Others argue it was unnecessarily risky, that it violated the principle of force protection, that it put American soldiers in danger for marginal intelligence gains. They point to the casualty rates at Jay and Illingworth as evidence that the strategy was flawed. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. The strategy worked in some ways. It failed in others. It accomplished objectives, but at a high cost. Whether that cost was justified depends on your perspective, your values, your understanding of what war requires. What's undeniable is that the men who fought at Illingworth deserve our respect and gratitude. They did what was asked of them. They held their ground. They fought with courage. They earned their place in military history. Whether the strategy that put them there was wise or foolish, ethical or problematic, doesn't diminish their personal courage and sacrifice. They were soldiers. They did their duty. That's all anyone can ask. What can modern military forces learn from Fire Support Base Illingworth? What lessons does this battle offer for contemporary warfare? First, the importance of combined arms coordination. Illingworth survived because of artillery support from other bases, because of helicopter gunships, because of AC-1119 gunships providing close air support. No single element could have saved the Firebase alone. It took coordination between multiple units, multiple types of forces, all working together toward a common objective. Modern warfare is even more dependent on combined arms. Infantry, armor, artillery, aviation, all must work together seamlessly. The technology has changed, but the principle remains the same. No service branch fights alone. Success comes from integration and coordination. Second, the critical importance of leadership at every level. Lieutenant Colonel Conrad's cool-headed command at the battalion level. Captain Ahern's skilled coordination of fire support. Lieutenant Peters leading his reconnaissance platoon. Sergeants and corporals holding their positions and keeping their soldiers fighting. Leadership at every echelon made the difference between survival and destruction. Military organizations invest heavily in leadership development for this reason. Technical skills matter, tactics matter. But leadership is what holds units together when everything goes wrong, when the plan falls apart, when survival depends on individual courage and unit cohesion. Third, the lesson about weapon reliability. The M16 rifles jamming from dust was a problem that had plagued the weapon since its introduction in Vietnam. The rifle worked beautifully in clean conditions, but became unreliable when exposed to harsh environments. This lesson drove decades of weapon development. Modern military rifles are designed with harsh conditions in mind. Reliability is paramount. Fourth, the importance of logistics and planning. Those 40 tons of 8-inch ammunition that exploded in the center of Illingworth, that was a logistics failure. The ammunition shouldn't have been delivered to a small temporary fire base. There was no need for it, no storage capacity for it, and when it exploded, it nearly destroyed the entire defensive position. Proper logistics planning could have prevented that catastrophe. Fifth, the moral and ethical implications of using troops in high-risk operations. The Firebase bait strategy raises questions that military leaders still grapple with today. How much risk is acceptable? When does tactical necessity justify putting soldiers in danger? How do you balance mission accomplishment against force protection? There are no easy answers. Every military operation involves risk. But commanders have a moral obligation to minimize unnecessary risk, to ensure that the potential benefits justify the danger, to care for their soldiers as more than just tactical pieces on a battlefield. Sixth, the importance of force protection measures. Conrad's decision not to use concertina wire was controversial. Some argued that wire might have slowed the enemy assault, might have saved lives. Others supported Conrad's reasoning that wire provided minimal obstacle value and could hinder friendly maneuver. Either way, the debate highlights the importance of carefully considering defensive measures. Modern forward operating bases use multiple layers of security: wire, barriers, sensors, watchtowers, quick reaction forces. Every measure is designed to make it harder for the enemy to attack successfully. The lessons of Illingworth and other fire-based battles influenced these modern force protection doctrines. Seventh, the value of air support and aviation assets. The Cobra gunships, the AC-119 Stinger, the medevac helicopters, all played crucial roles in the battle. Without them, Illingworth would have fallen. Air superiority and aviation support are fundamental to American military operations. That lesson has been reinforced in every conflict since Vietnam. Eighth, the human dimension of warfare. Battles aren't won by technology alone. They're won by people, by young soldiers who stand their ground when terrified, by leaders who inspire confidence under fire, by units that maintain cohesion in chaos. Peter Lemon, wounded and exhausted, fighting with his bare hands because his weapons jammed. That's not in any field manual. That's human courage, human determination, human will to survive. Military training tries to prepare soldiers for the stress of combat, but nothing can fully prepare someone for the reality. The noise, the fear, the confusion, the physical exhaustion, the psychological stress. What makes the difference is the human spirit, the refusal to quit, the commitment to your fellow soldiers. The legacy of fire support, Base Illingworth, lives on in multiple ways. The annual reunions at Fort Sill, the monument honoring the fallen, the Medal of Honor awarded to Peter Lemon, the stories told and retold by survivors and their families, the historical accounts and books written about the battle, including Philip Keith's Firebase Illingworth, an epic true story of remarkable courage against staggering odds. The battle is studied at military schools as a case study in small unit defensive operations. Future officers learn about Conrad's decisions, about the coordination of supporting fires, about the importance of unit cohesion. Illingworth has become part of military institutional knowledge. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler: the memory of 24 young Americans who gave their lives on a dusty fire base in the middle of nowhere. The recognition that 220 soldiers held their ground against 400 attacking enemy forces and refused to break. The understanding that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing your duty anyway. That's what Fire Support Base Illingworth represents. That's its legacy, not strategy, not tactics, but human courage in the face of impossible odds. Every year on April 1st, as Americans back home play pranks and practical jokes, a small group of aging veterans gather at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, or at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., or in their own homes. And they remember. They remember the friends who didn't come home, the young men who died on that dusty fire base 50-some years ago. They touch the names on the wall. They raise a glass and toast. They tell the stories one more time. Thank God I'm alive day. That's what Randall Richards calls it. Every April 1st, every year, another year of life granted by the sacrifice of his brothers who fell at Illingworth. The reunions are smaller now. Each year, more chairs sit empty. More names are read during the memorial service for survivors who've passed away since the last gathering. Vietnam veterans are in their 70s and 80s now. Time is running out for the men who lived through that night. Peter Lemon still wears his Medal of Honor, still speaks at veteran events, still tells the story of Casey Waller, Nathan Mann, and Brent Street. He's dedicated his life to ensuring their sacrifice isn't forgotten. At 74 years old, he continues to travel, to speak, to educate new generations about what happened at Illingworth. John Ahern and John Nayland, the two survivors who attended the 52nd anniversary ceremony in 2022, spoke about the importance of remembering. Each year there are less and less of us, Ahern said. But as long as even one of us remains, we'll be here on April 1st to honor our fallen brothers. Mike Conrad, The battalion commander who led the defense of Illingworth retired as a major general. He lived a long life, serving his country with distinction for decades after that April night. But he never forgot Illingworth, never forgot the men who died under his command. At reunions, he would sit with his former soldiers, now old men like himself, and they would remember together. The battlefield itself is gone. Nature has reclaimed Fire Support Base Illingworth. If you traveled to that spot today, 35 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh, 5 kilometers from the Cambodian border, you'd find nothing but jungle and a small clearing. You might see faint traces of earthworks if you knew where to look, but mostly it's just another patch of Vietnamese jungle. The base existed for less than a month, March 17th to April 2nd, 1970. 46 days. And for one night of those 46 days, it was the most important place in the world to 220 American soldiers and 400 North Vietnamese soldiers fighting for their lives. April 1st, 1970, was the deadliest day of the deadliest month of the Vietnam War. Over 730 American soldiers died that month across South Vietnam. On April 1st alone, the NVA launched attacks on 115 targets throughout the country and 13 ground assaults. Illingworth was the most costly in American casualties. 24 killed, 54 wounded, 40% casualties. But the firebase held. The Americans survived. They accomplished their mission. And they wrote a chapter of military history that deserves to be remembered. The story of Fire Support Base Illingworth is a story about many things, about strategy and tactics, about the difficult decisions commanders make, about the price soldiers pay, about courage and sacrifice, about young men thrust into impossible situations who somehow found the strength to prevail. It's a story about a 19-year-old Canadian immigrant who earned the Medal of Honor while high on marijuana, about artillerymen forced to fight as infantry, about weapons that jammed at the worst possible moment and men who fought with their bare hands when their weapons failed, about an ammunition explosion that should have ended the battle but somehow didn't, about helicopter pilots who flew into hell to provide support and evacuate the wounded, about a battalion commander who did everything right and still lost 24 men. It's a story about the bait strategy, about using American soldiers as lures to draw out the enemy, about the moral questions that raises, about whether the ends justified the means, about how the men who were used as bait feel about it 50 years later. It's a story about brotherhood, about bonds forged in combat that last a lifetime, about men who would die for each other, and some who did. But most of all, it's a story about courage, not the Hollywood version of courage, where heroes never feel fear and everything works out in the end. Real courage, the courage to keep fighting when you're terrified, the courage to stand your ground when every instinct screams at you to run, the courage to do your duty even when you know you might die doing it. That's what Fire Support Base Illingworth represents. That's why we tell this story. That's why it matters. On April 1st, 1970, 220 young Americans stood on a dusty fire base in the middle of nowhere and refused to quit. They held their ground. They did their duty. 24 of them paid the ultimate price. 54 more were wounded. But the fire base didn't fall. That's the story of Fire Support Base Illingworth. That's the legacy of the men who fought there. And that's why, every April 1st, we remember, Thank God I'm Alive Day. For those who survived, for those who didn't, a promise. You will not be forgotten. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Your courage will not be forgotten. As long as there's someone left to tell the story, as long as there's someone left to remember, Fire Support Base Illingworth will live on. And when the last veteran of that battle is gone, when there's no one left who was there, the story will still be told. Because it's a story that needs to be told. A story that deserves to be told. A story of remarkable courage against staggering odds. The story of Fire Support Base Illingworth. April 1st, 1970. The deadliest day of the deadliest month. The day 220 Americans refused to break. That's how we remember them. That's how we honor them. By telling their story. By preserving their legacy. By ensuring that future generations know what they did, what they sacrificed, what they represented. Fire Support Base Illingworth. Never forget.